Hello and welcome to Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland's first town hall. Congresswoman, do you want to start it with some opening remarks?
Right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining me for my very first town hall meeting as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, proudly representing the 10th Congressional District of Washington State. My name is Marilyn Strickland. It's my honor to be here tonight, and thank you for joining us. Town hall meetings are a chance for elected officials to sit down with the folks and communities that we represent and really learn more about what's on your mind, some of the things that I'm working on, and how we can work together to improve our communities. And, if we weren't in the midst of a pandemic, I would be with you physically in different locations around the entire district. But in the age of technology, we are here on Facebook Live. I'm thrilled to have a very special guest here, my good friend, Dr. Fathi, and he will talk about the pandemic and vaccines and provide some more information about that later. A lot of people have asked me, what's it been like for your first 7 weeks in Congress? And I tell people that the welcome that we received in Congress in January was not the one that we freshmen were expecting. On Sunday, January 3rd, we were sworn into the 117th Congress. And just a few days later, there was a failed coup attempt to overturn the legitimate election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. The good news about that is that we got right back to work that same night and stayed until 3 o'clock in the morning to certify the election results, demonstrating that democracy did continue to march forward. The following Wednesday, another Wednesday in January, the House submitted articles of impeachment. And then the following Wednesday, another Wednesday in January, we attended the inauguration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and got them sworn in. So I tell folks that it's been an eventful start to Congress. We're in the middle of a pandemic, an economic crisis, and we survived an insurrection. And I think about the imagery of that first week where I had the opportunity to wear a hanbok, which is a traditional Korean dress. The insurrection took place, and then you saw images of people of color who worked here with the custodial staff cleaning up after a Confederate flag was marched through the halls of Congress. You saw my friend Andy Kim, a congressman, on his knees picking up the pieces. So as we think about moving forward, this is really about picking up the pieces, getting our economy back on track, and doing what we can to address this pandemic. Now, in the middle of all this, I've actually been hard at work as well. It's hard to think it's been only 7 weeks because it feels like it's been so much longer than that because so much has happened. But one thing that I'm very proud of is that I actually added an amendment to the National Apprenticeship Act that did pass. And the amendment really ensured that we are affirmatively taking action to invest in recruiting and retaining underserved communities and underrepresented communities into our national apprenticeship programs. Women, people of color, veterans, children coming out of the foster care system, and even people who have had run-ins with the criminal justice system. And so when young people age out of foster care, we want to make sure they have an opportunity to get a good job. And certified registered apprenticeships are a good way to have a good career path without incurring a lot of debt, sometimes none at all. And then I was proud to work with my colleague, Congressman Derek Kilmer, to now serve as the co-chair of the Puget Sound Recovery Caucus, because we know that Puget Sound, one of the largest estuaries in the country, is sick. Even though things have been cleaned up for a while, our growing population means that the sound is still polluted. We're going to create an office in the Environmental Protection Agency. We want to elevate the status of the Puget Sound the same way we think of the Great Lakes and the way we think of Chesapeake Bay. And then finally, I drafted a letter and I got nearly 50 of my colleagues in Congress to sign on to ensure that the new Recovery Act has $350 billion that goes directly to local government, because local government knows best when it comes to what their communities need. And we're fighting really hard to make sure that that stays in. And then finally, I talk about the fact that voices and representation matter. And I serve on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and I invited the chairman of the Puyallup Tribe of Indians to testify at that committee to talk about the importance of ensuring access to clean and safe water for all communities. Now, as far as the other things I want to work on, it includes everything from expanding access to affordable housing, working with Joint Base Lewis McChord, the largest military installation on the West Coast, to ensure that our military personnel and their families and veterans are taken care of. Federal funding for vaccinations and more testing, and Dr. Fathi will talk about this. Creating more jobs by investing in infrastructure, addressing healthcare reform, passing paid family leave, addressing climate change by investing in infrastructure, doing things that we know will help change people's behavior, and also ensuring that we're keeping the Puget Sound clean and cleaning it up. And then finally, doing what we can to protect Social Security and Medicare. As a member of the House Armed Services Committee, I am very, very excited to work with Chairman Adam Smith and doing what we can to ensure that the men and women who serve are protected, respected, and have an opportunity to thrive while they're serving our country. I also look forward to working with the Biden-Harris administration on their American Rescue Plan, which is going to be, again, $1.9 trillion to help fund vaccinations and do a lot of important work. So in light of what has happened this year, our nation battles a deadly pandemic that has taken the lives of 500,000 people and 5,000 Washingtonians. But I want to hold this town hall to hear directly from you. Some people have submitted questions in advance, and some of you will have a chance to submit your questions tonight too. But I want to now turn this over to my guest, Dr. Jay Fathi, who has decades of experience and expertise in the medical field. He's going to give us some insight about questions regarding the ongoing pandemic. He serves as the clinical assistant professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Washington School of Medicine and physician executive managing director at Fathi Consulting LLC. In addition to his medical and public health background, he also brings a strong perspective on the issues that we'll talk about today, as a husband, as a father, as a neighbor, and as a fellow Washingtonian. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jay Fathi. Thank you so much for being here today, and go ahead and make some remarks and kick off the Q&A.
Congresswoman, thank you so much, and thank you so much for your service. To say that the first 7 weeks of your tenure was eventful is quite an understatement, and we're very glad that you're representing our state in the 10th district. Again, as Congresswoman Strickland said, I have over 25 years experience in family medicine and community health in Washington State. I am a lifetime Washingtonian, along with my wife, and we're raising 2 teenage boys. We've been hearing so much bad news in the last year about this pandemic, but finally we do have some good news. This vaccine is the best thing that's happened since the pandemic started. COVID is now a vaccine preventable disease. Now, this is music to the ears of doctors and nurses. It means we can prevent the disease with a vaccine. This is a game changer. And like I said, it's the best news we've had since this whole thing started. Very simply put, just focusing on the vaccine for a bit here, getting the vaccine can save your life. It cuts your chances dramatically of getting infected. And even if you do get infected after you've been vaccinated, your risk of getting hospitalized or having serious complications or dying is tremendously lower once you've had the vaccine. Both of the vaccines that are available now, and there's going to be a third one probably officially approved this week that is only a one shot, have all been well studied. They were all studied in tens of thousands of people as far as safety and efficacy, and they are just as safe as any other vaccine that's available right now in the United States. I personally have got my vaccine. My wife, who is a nurse, has got her vaccines, and my own mother, who's 87, and her husband, who is 90, has got the vaccine. And I'm recommending to all my patients and essentially everyone get the vaccine. Now, from a standpoint of actually how to get it, obviously that's a challenge for so many of us. This has never happened before in our lifetimes. We all know that now, right? It's been 100 years since something like this happened. We essentially need to not only vaccinate essentially every Washingtonian, but everybody in the country and almost everybody in the world. So it's a pretty heavy lift. The pharmaceutical companies are being pushed to try to produce all this vaccine as fast as possible, get it distributed to the states. And I know that our state Department of Health is doing the best they can to get it distributed to the localities, the local health departments. But because of that limited supply, I think everybody knows there is a tiering system right now, and we've created priority groups. The people that can get the vaccine right now are healthcare workers, people that live in nursing homes or assisted living or adult family homes or any sort of, the term is congregate senior living, or anyone over the age of 65. Also, if you're over the age of 50 and you live with someone who's over 65, you can get one. It's being pushed out to clinics, hospitals, health departments, and if you need to find out where to get your vaccine, the best thing to do is either call or go to the website of your local health department. And I checked all the websites currently, technically, I checked them today for Pierce, Mason, Thurston. There's updated information on all those websites for those health departments.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Fathi, and thank you, Congresswoman. And thank you everyone at home for joining us this evening. So as the Congresswoman mentioned, we're going to start off by having the Congresswoman and Dr. Fathi answer some of the questions that were pre-submitted and then move to questions from the live feed. We welcome your questions and encourage you to type them in the comment section. In order to take your live question, we do need you to include your first name and zip code at the end of the question. So let's get started. Congresswoman, we received a couple of similar questions and you kind of started to touch on this. And thanks so much to Antoinette, Carolyn, in Thurston County and James and Pierce County. But they want to know a little bit more of, what are your plans? What plans do you have to accomplish in the other Washington that will benefit residents here in our district?
Great. Well, thank you very much for submitting those questions. And thank you for the question, Liz. When you make the decision to run for Congress, especially when you live on the West Coast of the United States, you're making a lifestyle decision. So clearly you want to serve your community, but you are spending 4.5 hours coming east and 5.5 hours coming west if you travel every week and getting to and from your Washington state to your DC place. And so when I think about the why, it really is a few things. It's a deep, abiding love for my community in Washington state. I grew up in Tacoma and Pierce County. And it's also being acutely aware that the district is growing and changing. The 10th Congressional District of Washington state spans everywhere from Shelton to Puyallup and beyond, going east and west, and East Tacoma down to Tumwater, going north-south, and all points in between. And if you think about the district, it is urban, rural, suburban, and it is diverse in every possible sense of the word. And I say that with great pride. So as I think about the why, I think about the fact that more people are moving to the South Puget Sound into our district. And we have to make sure that we have adequate housing, that we're updating our infrastructure, that we're protecting the Puget Sound, but more importantly, that we are ensuring that the people who call the 10th District home are having their basic needs met. And so during my 7 weeks here so far, here's some things that I've worked on. I, again, led the 48 members of the House to submit a letter to ensure that the $1.9 trillion recovery package, relief package, includes $350 billion that going to go to local government. And this is going to do a lot of things. It's going to help ensure that people stay employed who work in government. It's going to fund safety net programs like the Community Development Block Grants, or as people in local government affectionately call CDBG funds. It's going to keep first responders, frontline healthcare workers, and other providers of vital safety in their jobs to continue to provide basic services. And it's also going to, help ensure that we're able to get through this pandemic and to ensure that people have the resources that they need. One thing I want to share with you is my committee appointments. And when you come to Congress, you are assigned committees, and then you can join a lot of caucuses. And so I am a member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, where I serve on the subcommittees of highways and transit and railroads, pipeline, and safety. I also serve on the House Armed Services Committee, where I serve on the subcommittees for military personnel and readiness. And I just want to make sure that as a member of Congress, I'm doing what I can to bring much needed infrastructure investments to the 10th District. And that's everything from helping fund mass transit, light rail, adding bus lanes, BRT, bus rapid transit, doing the work that's going to help ensure that we have more affordable housing, because that's now part of transportation and infrastructure, expanding broadband access, because we know that to fully participate in the 21st century, you have to have access to broadband. So I think it's a very important committee that's relevant to our district. And then also on the House Armed Services Committee. Joint Base Lewis McChord is the largest military installation on the West Coast. It employs tens of thousands of people, and it has an economic impact of $8 billion per year. We want to make sure that the people who are serving, who have served, are being treated with respect and dignity and have their basic needs met. And that includes everything from housing to resources, and ensuring that we can do right by them, because they are basically fighting for our country to keep us safe. I'm acutely aware of the fact that despite the fact that we're in Washington state and Governor Inslee has done a great job of trying to really address the pandemic, there are too many people who are still suffering. And we want to make sure that people's basic needs are met, that they get access to the vaccine, and we're doing everything we can to support local government. As a former mayor, I am acutely aware that having a strong partnership with the federal delegation in Congress often helps get projects funded and provides much needed resources. So I am completely ready to do that. And I thank you for that question.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So moving on, we also received many questions about, your federal environmental priorities, including your position on how to best impact or mitigate the impacts of climate change, a bill called HR 763, which is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, for those at home that aren't familiar with that bill, and generally on environmental justice. These questions came from Tybor, Regan, Edward, Joe, Stewart, and Joseph in Thurston County, and Mary in Pierce County. So Congresswoman, can you share with us a little bit more about kind of what your federal environmental priorities are? And can you also share with us kind of what connections you see between racial justice and environmental justice, and what are your plans to ensure Black people are prioritized both in economics and employment in a future, more environmentally friendly society?
Okay, so that's about a 5-part question, but I'm going to take every part of it because it is a very important topic. And so, as we think about environmental justice and racial justice, we have to also understand that that includes economic justice, because those things are connected to each other. And, one of the ways to do that comes through a couple of the things that I'm already working on. The Puget Sound Recovery Caucus that I'm co-chairing with Garrett Kilmer is really important, because the Puget Sound belongs to all of us, and we know that there is a history there to make sure that everyone's rights are respected, and that we're doing what we can to make sure that that beautiful sound is preserved for future generations. It's a part of our identity in the South Puget Sound and so crucial to who we are. The other thing that I'm working on too is being part of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And that includes investing in infrastructure for clean water, for mass transit, which is going to get cars off the road, and even making sure that we're being innovative in a future package that will include ways to help build out electric charging stations for communities. We know that transportation represents one of the biggest causes of carbon emissions, and we can do what we can to reduce those emissions. The other thing that's important too is, I did some research on House Resolution 763, and this is the fee, the carbon fee, and a dividend. And from what I learned, it proposes in the beginning to have a fee or a dividend that will be about $250-ish to every adult, and a smaller amount to every child. And the premise of this is based on, by taxing carbon or putting a fee on carbon, people will often say that, well, we're just going to pass it on to consumers. By providing this dividend, it helps offset some of that. And the plan, I believe, too, is to increase that amount so that the dividend becomes larger and larger, and people appreciate having that dividend. I have not done a ton of research on that, but I always have an open mind about ways to reduce our carbon footprint and doing what we can to hold people accountable. So I'm very open to exploring more about it and learning about who's sponsoring it here in the caucus and finding ways to really address climate change. But I do believe, too, that the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee that I serve on is probably one of the most important paths to get to a future that's going to address climate change in a meaningful way. So much of what we have to do is invest in a clean energy infrastructure. And again, that's investing in more mass transit and allowing people to drive electric vehicles, and even updating our power grid so that we are not so dependent on fossil fuels. The good thing about this approach as well is that it's inclusive, and there's an element of environmental justice in it. When we talk about environmental justice, we typically think of communities of color or communities that are underserved or living in poverty being affected disproportionately by pollution. And that is absolutely true. But as we talk about the recovery and investment in these jobs, we have to make sure that those same communities get access to apprenticeship training, that minority-owned businesses get access to procurement opportunities, so that as we tackle the environment and pollution through investing in infrastructure, that those jobs are going to the very communities that are often disproportionately affected by it. So we can talk more about this later, but those are some of the things that I'm working on right now, and I look forward to the next question. And thank you for submitting that question.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. We've also received a couple of questions on the COVID response and vaccine distribution. So Dr. Fathi, I'm going to turn it to you. This is a two-parter, so bear with me while I read through all of this. So John and Pierce was relaying to us that about 91% of the deaths from COVID in Pierce County are in the age group of 60 plus. 74% are in the age group of 70 plus. If a strong effort was made to vaccinate these folks as soon as possible, the total death count for Pierce County could have been greatly reduced. So why not start now, even though it is late, to save as many old people as possible? We are not expendable. That's part one. The second part is that Demita from Pierce and Wilson and Jessica from Thurston and Pierce counties want to know, how are we going to address additional costs of masks and supplies for those on fixed incomes? Why is it so hard to get a vaccine appointment still, multiple weeks in for many folks? And can Washington State manufacture rapid response, easy to use COVID infection tests so that our school children can be tested with ease?
That also is like 5 questions, all very, very good. Those are great questions. So let me address, first of all, the prioritization. It kind of goes back a little bit to what I was saying initially. This is a Herculean lift that has never been done in the history of the world before. So we have to prioritize. And you're exactly right. There is precedent on this. This isn't the first time a new vaccine has become available. Vaccines are introduced to the market all the time for children, for adults, for everybody. The flu shot comes out new every year because it mutates, and that's why you get a new flu shot every year, because it's a little bit different every year, which is probably going to happen with COVID. But you have to prioritize. And so obviously when you have a crisis that, as Congresswoman Strickland mentioned, 500,000 Americans have died and about 2.5 million people around the world have already died, you have to make sure that the people that are set up to take care of those folks get vaccinated first, because we need a functioning, living, healthy medical infrastructure to take care of folks. That's why in Washington State, anyone that is a healthcare worker of any type, including someone that's doing environmental services at a nursing home for low-income individuals, that person's a tier 1A. So anyone that's around adults that are living together or in a hospital situation, that's tier 1A. The next tier that has been opened up is anybody over 65 for the exact reason that the questioner mentioned. These people are the most vulnerable. These are the people that have the highest risk. They don't have a high risk of catching COVID. They have a high risk of getting very sick from it, getting pneumonia or organ system failure, ending up in the hospital, and unfortunately causing the majority of deaths around the world. It is mostly in older individuals. So that's why that group has been prioritized. And I think we're doing a good job. We're doing the best we can, and it's going to get much, much better. We got a curveball with the weather across the entire country last year that delayed things, but that's going to end up hopefully just being a hiccup. And then we're going to see a big, well, we're not going to use the term glut. That would be a great situation to be in, but we're going to see more vaccine, and it's going to continue to be produced. And eventually, hopefully quite soon, it's going to be pretty easy to make an appointment or walk into any pharmacy. That's just happening, and you get the COVID vaccine. It's happening slowly but surely. I love the question about funding for protective equipment. That's absolutely critical. And we have the expert to talk to you about that, because my reaction would be, I'm not an elected member of Congress, but I personally philosophically think that's what government is for. It is to protect the health and well-being of its citizens, particularly its most vulnerable citizens. And, we won't get too philosophical, but in some ways, a lot of us in public health realized when this thing all hit last year that we've been preparing for the wrong war. We knew something like this was going to happen. We have the means to create enough masks and enough gloves and enough ventilators and all that stuff. And we're doing a much better job. But I would, for that piece of the question, if it's okay, I'd love to hear from the Congresswoman on that, how to pay for it.
Yeah, so, the question is about the additional costs of masks, supplies, online orders, and deliveries for those on fixed incomes, or just in general. So I'd say there are a few things we have to do. People who manufacture things like those types of supplies are very, very conscientious about the demand, how many of them want to produce, and then who's going to buy them. And manufacturers typically don't want to have a lot of inventory sitting around. What we've learned, however, is that the inventory numbers just are all over the map. Sometimes we hear we don't have enough. Sometimes we hear that they're being stockpiled. And so we need to be transparent about how many units of everything we have. But here's where the government can come in. The government needs to work with these organizations, or these companies, so to speak, who are actually manufacturing them, and say, look, we know this is what it costs to make it. And if you don't think that manufacturing this amount is going to put you in the red or not be profitable for you, then we're going to try to help make sure that you have what you need to manufacture them. And the reality is that these are businesses that produce these, that mass produce them. I will say this, though. We shouldn't have to rely on overseas production to get the equipment that we need here at home. We have the manufacturing capacity here in the United States. And so we have to work with the businesses that are producing these things, find the right price point, but ensure that we have a sufficient supply. So that way, when people who need access, maybe on fixed incomes, they can get them at a discounted rate, so it's more equitable. But that's a really, really good question, because I've heard estimates all over the map. And the bottom line here is that a pandemic is going to test our system. We have to make sure we have ample protective equipment. And also, too, I really think that wearing masks is going to be more commonplace, like it is in other parts of the world during flu season, when people are in public. And so if we're doing things to protect our health, I think that masks are going to be here long after the pandemic is over and in advance of the next one.
Absolutely. I agree with you for certain on all points, Congresswoman. This is a great example of where there needs to be a public-private partnership. We can do this domestically, no problem. And I think with the new administration, with the Biden administration, we're starting to see that.
Yeah.
Prioritize it appropriately. This is like mission critical. We have to,
Yeah.
we have to get ahead of this. And I think we finally are. There was another question on tests. And I'll say quickly about tests. Testing certainly isn't going to go away. Everything is tools in a tool chest. Staying 6 feet apart from people, closing everything down, which we had to do last year, wearing masks, avoiding crowds, that's one tool. Another huge tool is a vaccine. These vaccines so far work. They're all powerful. There's going to be more coming to market. This is all good news. And again, I encourage everyone that can to get a vaccine. But tests are also going to be a part of it because no vaccine is 100%.
Yeah.
Good vaccines lower your chances of catching something tremendously, but there's still going to be roles for tests, including in schools. And again, I think it's going to probably be similar to the mask situation with public-private partnership. I'm confident that Congress, under the leadership of people like Congressman Strickland and the new administration, is going to prioritize this because we're going to see more testing being done because it will make it safer for everyone to be getting back to our normal lives.
You know, and I want to jump in and editorialize a bit because I do really believe that we have to have a conversation of getting our educators properly vaccinated before we fully open schools. And I'd say the good news is that Johnson & Johnson, I believe, is coming up with a vaccine that's going to be 1 dose. And if we can start to really mass produce that, then I think a lot of people are going to feel better about coming back to work to go to school. And parents are going to feel better about bringing their students to school because we know that, you know, you have a class of students now who have lost a year, even though they've been doing things online. That doesn't work for every kid. And especially with young people, a lot of them need that social, emotional contact. And often the teacher that they see every day is a very positive adult relationship for them. And they just need that to learn. And so we could probably have a whole other conversation about when's it safe to open schools. But I just do believe that that conversation about vaccination really has to be a big part of whether we're going to open schools and the rate at which we're going to do it.
I agree.
Thank you, Dr. Fathi, and thank you, Congresswoman. So Congresswoman, our next question is from Nathan.
Okay.
And his question is, with so much focus on domestic issues, what are the foreign policy priorities?
Okay, well, that's a very, very good question. And, you know, I think sometimes when we talk about foreign policy, people don't think of that topic as things that are relevant to what happens in your daily life. But foreign policy determines whether or not someone's child gets sent to war. Foreign policy often dictates trade policy. Foreign policy literally affects us every single day. And so when I think about foreign policy in the context of what we need to do, I would say there are some priorities that are really, really important. And I'd say the first one is climate change. We know that climate change is a global issue and is related to foreign policy. And I'm thrilled to know that President Biden has talked about rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, but we have to work together, especially the largest nations that emit the most carbon, to really come up with what we're going to do at the local and state and national level to address climate change. I think that is a big foreign policy issue. The other issue is replenishing the State Department. We know that the relationships that we have with a lot of our allies around the world are fractured, and I'm glad that President Biden understands the importance of diplomacy and what we need to do to ensure that we have foreign policy that's going to restore our standing in the world, but really allow us to lead the way that people expect us to. And then I will also talk about just some things that are really personal for me. I am Korean American and African American, and I know that when we think about the Korean War, it really has never officially been declared over. And so I am hopeful that we can think about what that means and how we declare it over. And then also think about the Divided Families Reunification Act, which is going to be a collaboration with the State Department and Korean governments to reunite families. The other thing that's important to me too is, to look at ways to look at Korean adoptees here in the States and how we can fast track immigration. Another issue related to foreign policy is the fact that Washington State is the most trade-dependent state in the United States. And we need to make sure that we have strong international partners and good relationships and trade policy that really benefits the companies and the workers here at home. And then another issue too with foreign policy is reproductive health around the world. We need to make sure that women have access and that we repeal the Helms Amendment, which really keeps us from helping women in other countries get access to safe and legal abortion. So I have a lot I can say about foreign policy, but foreign policy is domestic policy and very relevant to what we do here at home every day. Thanks.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So now we have a question on housing. As you know, it is getting quite expensive to live in the South Sound, whether it's renting or buying a home. What can you do to help us on this front?
Well, thank you for that question. If you think about the entire Puget Sound region, that's everything from Everett all the way down to Tumwater along the I-5 corridor, we're about 250,000 units short of what we need in the last decade as far as number of people here in housing units. So we clearly have a housing shortage crisis, and that's manifesting itself in a lot of different ways. It's harder for people to find places to rent. It's hard for people to become homeowners, which is one of the ways that people build wealth, and it has exacerbated the homelessness crisis. So I think about what we can do at the federal level. I acknowledge the fact that as a former mayor, I know that so much of what happens with housing is very local, and that local land use rules are often the biggest barrier to adding more housing. But I also know that the federal government can make a more significant investment. We do not have the public resources we need to build all the affordable housing, but we can form partnerships with the private sector and builders and figure out how we can build more housing for people at every stage of their lives. The House is now taking decisive action to pass the American Rescue Plan this week, and that's the $1.9 trillion rescue plan. And there is actually legislation in there to address the housing issue, and I want to share some of these with you. $9.9 billion of direct assistance to states, territories, and tribes to address the needs of homeowners who are struggling to afford their homes. $19 billion for emergency rental and utility assistance. $5 billion for emergency choice housing vouchers. $100 million to support unassisted households living in properties supported by the USDA's 515 affordable housing programs. $750 million to help Alaska Natives, Native Americans, and Native Hawaiians to respond to housing needs during this pandemic. And then also investments in infrastructure, boosting our affordable housing infrastructure, increasing the federal investment in the low-income housing tax credit, and establishing a new neighborhood investment tax credit to subsidize housing. And then one more editorial here that I want to make is that Marcia Fudge, who is a member of the Congressional Black Caucus and soon to be former Congresswoman, is going to be the new Secretary of HUD. And she's a former mayor. And in conversations I've had with her, she understands deeply the relationship between local and federal to ensure that we have more housing. But here's what's important. She understands the relationship between housing, transportation, and the environment. And if we're able to do those things, we can build more housing, address climate change, and be very responsible as we think about our future. So I'm excited to get to work on housing issues. I have a lot of opinions about them and a lot of ideas. And if you have some more, please think about how we can be helpful. And finally, with housing, as we think about housing the people who are homeless, especially some of our chronically homeless neighbors, we have to allow the federal government to help fund things that are innovative. We like to fund something that has been built or renovated and cut a ribbon and talk about what we contributed, but we have to think about different types of housing and what it means to be securely housed, dormitory style housing, even tiny homes, but really innovating and working with local communities to help fund some of these things that we know can get people safely housed. So again, that could be a whole topic unto itself, but we're doing a lot in housing, and I look forward to working with my colleagues in Congress to support local communities.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. So the next is actually a comment from Christopher and Thurston, who I believe volunteers for a 501c3 that is completely all volunteer based and doesn't have any paid staff. So his comment in question is 501c3 nonprofit organizations who are ineligible for the EIDL or PPP are ineligible because technically they don't have anyone on payroll and solely rely on volunteers. However, given the recession, right, there are, they've had less donations coming in and there's not enough tax incentives for private donors and businesses at this time. Many government grants measure needs for funds based on lost revenue or cut back on employees, but there are smaller nonprofits who do not generate revenue through sales or have employees. There are many nonprofits like ours who have discontinued their volunteering program during the pandemic lockdown and canceled fundraising events, ultimately relying on personal savings to remain operational. Do you have any feedback or comments to Christopher's question?
Well, Christopher, first of all, thank you for sharing that story with us. And I appreciate that you have an organization that is volunteer run. But here's the deal, no employees does not mean no expenses. And so as we look at recovery funds that will go directly to cities, I think this is a good example of individual cities understanding, how funds can be used. I know that there have been great partnerships with chambers of commerce and economic development boards in getting funding out to different employers. And even though you're not technically an employer, you do have expenses and you do a lot of good in the community. And so I would say reach out to your local community to find out what is available. And I do appreciate that the work that you do, and thanks for reminding us that there are volunteer organizations that may not have payroll, but it doesn't mean you don't have expenses, and you do contribute a lot to the community. So thank you for the work you do, and I will have my staff look into it, and we will try to hook you up with some resources.
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. And Christopher, yes, we'll have a staff member be reaching out to you later this week. Our next question comes from Nathan and Pierce. Congresswoman, what are your visions on police reform and racial justice?
Great. So those are two very large, heady topics, but I will say that policing is a local issue. And there are so many things that affect policing that don't even deal with police departments. And that's everything from how are we funding mental health and social services? What is the court system like? What does it mean when someone is brought up on charges? And even making sure that we are working with people in local communities and mayors to ensure that we are going to be very thoughtful and doing what we can to support the work that's happening. I'm very proud to be a co-sponsor and signatory to the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And that particular piece of legislation deals with things like qualified immunity, banning chokeholds, ensuring that police departments have body cameras, and really engaging in implicit bias training. Now, is that going to solve every problem at the local level? Probably not, because local communities are very unique and they decide what it means to be safe. And every person who lives in every community, regardless of zip code, deserves to be safe. And interactions with police officers need to be places where people feel safe, where they know they can get help. And so it's a very complicated issue, but I do believe that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which has a good chance of passing in the House, is one way for the federal government to supplement the work that's happening at the local level. And as far as my position on racial justice, it is 2021. And when there was the violent insurrection on January 6th, we saw a Confederate flag roll through the halls of Congress. So we know that racial justice is something that is an ongoing quest. It is something that is economic, social, environmental, and related to health. But we also know that this is one of those periods in America's history when we are having finally conversations about race and justice. And I tell folks that when we talk about equity, equity is not a zero-sum game that takes away something from one group to give it to another. Equity is something that helps level the playing field and ensures that all people are treated with dignity and respect. It also recognizes that some communities need more resources than others because they have been historically underserved and marginalized. So I definitely am proud of being a sponsor of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And you can be assured that as I think about policymaking, I will always do so through the lens of racial equity.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So now we're going to turn to the questions that have been submitted during our Facebook Live. The first one is for you, Congresswoman. Courtney from Olympia has a question. She says, Washington State, including the 10th District, has had paid family leave now for about 2 years. Are you supporting the Family Act to expand that beyond our state to the rest of the U.S.? And do you believe it could pass the House and Senate without reconciliation, aka with bipartisan support? I happen to know that you have sponsored this bill. So if you want to let Courtney know some other thoughts, that would be great.
Great. Well, thank you for that question, Courtney. I'm actually a co-sponsor of the Family Act, and it is something that is incredibly important. And as you think about these types of policies that before the pandemic, before the economic crisis, seems something that would be hard to do, I do believe that there's a good opportunity for it to pass. But I want to talk about the reconciliation process for a minute. So I'm going to do a bit of schoolhouse rock here for a second. So in order to pass a law, you have to have both the House and the Senate agree to it, and then the president signs it into law. And I'm confident that it will pass the House because we have a Democratic majority, and we'll probably get some Republicans to sign on as well. But there's a process called reconciliation, where you typically need 60 votes in the Senate to have anything pass. But we've utilized reconciliation where all we need is a simple majority for it to pass. And so I am very optimistic that it is something that everyone can get behind. It is good for families. It is good for education. It is good for the economy. And we are long overdue to have that type of policy at the national level. And so for those of you who are watching, reach out to your representatives, reach out to people who aren't your representatives, and just let them know that this needs to be a priority in the 117th Congress.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So our next question is actually for Dr. Fathi. It's from Helen. She wants to know if you can share more about the global need for general health support, i.e. the treatment and testing of TB, AIDS, malaria, which have been greatly affected by the COVID pandemic.
Well, thank you for that question. And that is a heavy question. I must say I am not a global health expert, so I don't know if I can speak specifically to that issue, but one of the things that it does bring up is the divisiveness that unfortunately our country was seemingly contributing to on the global stage last year, and the lack of cooperation. This is a time, if there has ever been a time in history, where every nation on the planet must come together. It must be about unity, and that has happened for the COVID, for the pandemic. There are many, many governments and scientists and doctors and experts that around the world were collaborating to try to get these vaccines, for example, developed as safely and as quickly as possible. So I think the global cooperation is key. And I know that, again, I think under the Biden administration, we're going to see more of that. We already are in many other areas, and we're going to see it in the area of health. We have a very strong health foundation in our country that contributes to global health. And it's been kind of, for lack of a better term, it feels like it's been on the back burner. And I'm sure that, I know the Congresswoman's also a watchful eye. We can get back to where we have been before, which is being global leaders in addressing things like TB and malaria and these things that we have the means as a human race to practically eradicate, if not make massive strides on. So from a global standpoint, I am excited to see see our country's leadership be back where it belongs in trying to address these things from a global standpoint.
Thank you, Dr. Fathi. So folks at home, we have time for probably 2 more questions. Congresswoman, this next question is from Alessandra. She's a student at the University of Washington and an ambassador for the Borgen Project. And her question is the Borgen Project.
Okay.
And her question is, with 736 million people still living in extreme poverty worldwide and less than 1% of our budget going towards mitigating the issue, I wanted to know, what is your stance on increased funding for the international affairs budget? And should also like to know if you are supporting such efforts as the Global Health Security Act.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that question. And it's a very interesting one because there are millions of people around the world living in extreme poverty, but the standard of living around the world has actually improved dramatically. As far as providing international aid, I believe that is something that the United States should do. And it becomes one of those debates that people often have because they say, well, you're not taking care of people here at home. And so as a matter of foreign policy, I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that, people look to us around the world to provide help. And it doesn't mean that we're neglecting people here at home, but I support making sure that we look at foreign aid as a very important tool to build nations, to help people, and to ensure that, again, the leadership position that we've had for so long is something that we must maintain. I know that budget has been slashed, and we need to make sure that we're restoring it, or at least maintaining levels that we think are acceptable. It is a giant issue. And I think so much of it is really related to education. And even the last topic where we talked about access to global health and how we're dealing with things. It's a conversation about women's reproductive health. It's a conversation about women's economic empowerment, all those things. And so as we think about extreme poverty around the world, I think it's important to remember that the US does have a role to play, and we have a responsibility to help those. And it doesn't mean that we are neglecting the people here at home, because we have a poverty problem here in the United States as well, and it needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So for our last question of the night, it comes from Mitch in Thurston. He wants to know, what is your biggest surprise, something you did not expect since joining Congress? And you can't use the insurrection as your example.
Well, I wasn't expecting a coup, but I won't say that, Mitch. So I'd say my biggest surprise has been, I'm not really surprised, but I'd say a pleasant one. And, when you are, as a mayor and a member of the city council, I would make my trips to Washington, D.C. to meet with the delegation and to talk about the needs we had. And now I'm on the other side of the table in that conversation, even though no one can visit me just yet. And so I think that, when you're here, you realize that, you see things on TV, you see things on social media, and everything looks so divided and crazy. And when you're here, you just meet some of these people in person, and they are lovely, kind people who want to do the people's work and want to rep for their communities. And I boil it down to this. People have these personas, or you see them on television or in media, and you realize that, they're sons and daughters, aunts and uncles, mothers and fathers, grandparents in some cases, just folks who want to do the right thing and help people the best they can. And so I think that's probably been the biggest pleasant surprise. I'd say the other surprise for me too, and I don't know why it's a surprise for me, but this is a really large organization. Federal government is huge, and making changes to large institutions often takes much more time than an impatient mayor is used to having things get done. So I'm going to have to, practice more patience and grace. But I will say that statement I just made does not undermine the urgency with which we are treating and looking at these problems. We have a window here to do a lot of work in a short period of time for the American people. But my biggest surprise is just meeting some folks who you see who seem larger than life, and they're just regular folks like the rest of us doing the best they can.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I'm so sorry, Mitch. Mitch in Tacoma gave you that question, not Thurston County. So thank you.
Hey,
Mitch.
wait, okay, you better rep properly now. That is Mitch from Tacoma. Thank you, Mitch from Tacoma.
Well, thank you so much, Congresswoman and Dr. Fathi. Dr. Fathi, I'm going to turn it to you for any closing words. You want to talk about COVID response or vaccinations?
Yeah, thank you so much. Briefly, Congresswoman mentioned this, still wearing masks. So certainly, so much good news. The numbers are dropping, but this thing is not over. So no one can let their guards down. I hope everybody knows that. We still have to mask up, even if you're vaccinated. We still need to social distance. We still need to avoid crowds, avoid being inside for prolonged periods of time, and follow your local guidelines. I think Dr. Fauci made the best analogy when, this is a war. And we finally do have the upper hand against this virus and the pandemic. But he said, when you're in a battle and you're barely hanging on and the cavalry comes up behind you to the rescue, you don't stop fighting. And that's kind of a good way to think about it. The vaccine is a huge advance, like we've talked about. We still need to keep doing all these things. We have to have enough people get vaccinated in our communities. That's how the way it works for any germ. It eventually can't go anywhere, and it kind of dies out, can't spread, and it peters out. And in Washington State, 13% of people have gotten one dose so far. And we're only at 6% of people that have gotten 2 doses. So we got a ways to go. We want that number to be 75, 80, 85%. And again, eventually the vaccine will be much more available, and it'll be much easier for people to get it. And I'm very confident in the coming months, we're going to get to those numbers. And I guess very lastly, I would say, just from a standpoint of what we already talked about, unity, we just need to hang on a little bit longer. The end of this is in sight. We need to stick together. We can't have the approach of as every person for themselves. We need to take care of each other and all be leaders. And I'm confident as Washingtonians, we can do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fathi. Congresswoman, are there any closing remarks that you would like to share?
Well, I just want to second what Dr. Fathi said. We are not going to have a full economic recovery, get our students in school full time again until we get a critical mass of people vaccinated and then we all feel safe. And I think another thing I want to point out too is that so much of Washington State's economy depends on tourism, and we want people to feel safe visiting this amazing place that we call home. And so please get vaccinated, please mask up, because that's no guarantee that everything's over, because there are people out there who haven't been vaccinated yet. And, I would say, generally speaking, someone asked me on an interview earlier today, they said, any final words for the American public or the people you represent? And I'd say a few things. Help is on the way. And I believe that President Biden and this administration and the assertive acts that we are taking as members of Congress in my party is really focused on trying to get people the relief they need. And we need bipartisan support for a lot of these big bills. And I am optimistic that we'll get it. And even if we don't, we have the ability to use, budget reconciliation to get there. But our problems are too great to be divided. And I'm just hoping that we're able to find a way to come together. I wear a mask to protect other people. And I think that, as Dr. Fathi said, it's something that we owe each other. And then finally, as we talk about politics and elections, I often feel like America needs a civics lesson. And we can't do that right now on the fly, but I do hope that as we talk about politics, as we get into discourse, as we make decisions about what we're doing, let's do it based on facts. Let's be discerning about where we get our news. Let's be willing to engage with someone whose opinion may not be 100% with ours, but maybe a little different, and find ways that we can get there together. So those are my parting words. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. And thank you, Dr. Fathi, for being here for my first official town hall as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, proudly representing the mighty 10th Congressional District of Washington State. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you, Dr. Fathi. And thank you to everyone who joined us at home. Sorry we couldn't get to every question this evening. Please feel free to reach out to our team. The best number to call would be 360-459-8514. That's our Lacey office, or feel free to visit us online at strickland.house.gov. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.